I'm Adrian Martin, and I'll be talking you through 2 or 3 things I know about it. Jean-Luc Godard's film that he made in August and September of 1966, and it was premiered in early 1967. In fact, Godard made 2 films simultaneously in this period in 1966. He made a film called Made in USA, and he did this one. And the 2 films are extremely different. Made in USA is in some ways the end of one part of Godard's career, in that it has many references to American gangster films. It starred his ex-wife, Anna Karina, his star. And it has a style that we associate with the French New Wave. 2 or 3 things I know about it is the start of something in Godard's career. It looks forward to many of the films he would go on to make and the kind of films that he makes today. It's much closer to a kind of essay, a film essay, than it is a film narrative. And I'll talk about what these terms mean as we go through the film. 2 or 3 things I know about it was inspired by a series of articles that appeared in the French publication Nouvelle Observateur, the New Observer. It was a journalistic report by Catherine Villeneuve on basically life in the high-rises, and particularly this development at the northern part of Paris, these new suburbs that were being developed. This film is set in the suburb of Sarcelles, in the north part of Paris. And Godard is credited rightly with being one of the first filmmakers to really take an interest in these new suburbs that were being developed at this time. This particular place, Sarcelles, became far more hellish than it appears in this film as the years went by. And a film like La Haine, about the racial riots and conflicts and violence that goes on in the suburbs, is very much what today characterises this place that we see in the opening and closing stages of the film. At the start of the movie, Godard referred to a precise date, August 19, and he launched an attack against a guy, Paul Delouvrier, who'd just been made the prefect or the administrator-in-chief of this new Paris region. On a political level, the film is Godard's denunciation of what he called Gaullist power and this particular period in French politics. This is in some ways the start of Godard's intense left-wing politics, but as we'll see as we go on, it's tempered and complicated by a whole number of things in the film. I've referred to the film as an essay rather than a fiction. It does have a storyline of sorts, but the story is really only a very loose pretext for the kind of essay that he wants to make. The fiction, insofar as there is a story, is basically 24 hours in the life of the character, Juliette, played by Marina Vladi. Vladi, who we'll say more about later, was a French star of this period. She hadn't worked with Godard before. She had a great experience working on this film and always spoke very well of the very unusual shoot that it was. Godard was inspired by the reports in the newspaper and also things he was reading, particularly the work of a sociologist named Raymond Aron. Aron is by no means a left-wing sociologist or political theorist. In fact, in later years, he denounced the riots, the rioting workers and students of May '68, and he also became personal advisor to Henry Kissinger, probably much to Godard's disgust at a later time. But what Raymond Aron was writing about in this period of from the 50s to the mid-60s is that he wrote several books, and we've seen the cover of one of them called 18 Lectures on Industrial Society. Basically, Aron was trying to develop a theory of a new society, of an industrial society, which was very different from the old society. And Aron's focus was, on the one hand, that industrial society brings problems. It brings problems like consumerism, which is a big topic of this film. It brings problems of personal alienation, of overwork, of stress, of neurosis, urban neurosis, and so on. But it also brings opportunities and advantages and a higher standard of living and so on. And Godard was very interested in this analysis of modern society. In a piece that he wrote at the time of making the film for a newspaper, he said, "My real aim is to observe the vast mutation which our civilization is undergoing at present, and to ask myself, how can one best come to grips with this mutation?" Godard added, "I should say right away that I'm particularly happy to be living in France today, in our time, because the mutations are gigantic. And for a painter in letters," this is how Godard described himself, "a painter in letters, this is enormously exciting. In Europe today, and particularly in France, everything is stirring before our very eyes, and one must have eyes to see the provinces, youth, urban development, industrialisation. It's an extraordinary period. For me, describing modern living is not simply a matter of describing new gadgets and industrial developments, as some newspapers do, but of observing these mutations." Now, this gives you a very interesting sense of where Godard's head is at in 1966 when he made the film. As I say, the film is not as hard-line, left-wing political as a number of his films, particularly basically beginning 67, 68, will be. Godard still holds on to something from his earlier films like Bureau de Feu, Vivre sa vie, Contempt, and so on. He's holding on to a certain sense of poetry, of lyricism, and he's finding this lyricism in this new world, in this modern world. When I watch Two or Three Things, I often remember a comment that the great writer and theorist Roland Barthes said about Antonioni, Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni. He said that of Antonioni, "The apprehension you feel for this era is not that of the historian, the politician, or the moralist, but that of the utopian, who seeks to perceive the new world in precise detail, because he wants that world and he wants to be part of it." And I think that's very much Godard's attitude when he makes this film. There are many things he's criticising in this scene that's on at the moment. We get the first of many anti-American blasts, because of course the Vietnam War was raging, and Godard's anti-Americanism was already developing intensely, which for him meant precisely giving up the attachment to Hollywood movies, to Hollywood genre movies. And he made many comments in this period of basically how could he love John Ford's westerns, how could he love the Hollywood gangster movies when the atrocities were happening in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So he's in an interesting period where his political consciousness is growing and getting more intense. But he still wants to hold on to this idea that there's poetry in the new world, in the new industrial world, in the new suburban world. And it's remarkable that this film, which is really an extraordinary film on the aesthetic plane, what I mean is its colours, its editing, the interplay of the sound and the image, the very few snatches of music, which are from Beethoven's string quartet. All of this works in a way that's intensely poetic. So that Godard, in particular, he's looking at consumer society. He's looking at all these products that are everywhere and which fill the film, all of these consumer products. And he films them both to expose what consumer society is, the sort of false dreams that it sells ordinary people. But he's also interested in how good they look, how marvellous, how much like pop art all of these objects can look like. And this is a film which has a very intense sort of pop art aesthetic. This is something, this sense of the poetry in the modern world is something that would really disappear from Godard's films shortly after Two or Three Things. It would really only come back in a very different way, I think, in the 1980s, when Godard comes out of a period of making very interesting but very hermetic video works, and he starts making films again in 35mm, such as Sauve-qui-Peut and Hail Mary and Prénom Carmen and many others, up to today, Notre Musique, In Praise of Love, his more recent films, where the sense of the poetry that can be found in a broken modern world. I mean, it's very much this modern, and I think we could even say a sort of a futurist sort of vision of the modern world in this film. One of the articles that was written about it at the time, a commentator, Mauriac, said a fascinating thing about this movie. He said that the shots of the construction of the highway, the interchange in the film, he said that this motif of the interchange under construction on the North Highway outside of Paris reminds me of the artist Fernand Léger and the words the poet Louis Aragon spoke at the tomb of his friend. Aragon spoke of what Léger had particularly liked in modern life: the bright red gasoline pumps and the high-tension line pylons. And you can see that very intensely in this film, that there's both condemnation of the modern world and also a celebration of this strange modern industrial beauty. As I said, the beauty of a broken world. In this scene of the movie, this little kid here, Christophe Boursier, he was already a veteran of Godard's films. He'd already been in Married Woman 2 years earlier. Obviously, being in this film was a big formative experience on this kid, because he grew up to be a political historian who wrote a book on the French Maoism in the 60s, and also on the situationist philosopher Guy Debord. Very much the kinds of culture and the kinds of concerns that Godard was into in this period of the 60s, and that he helped develop through his films. Christophe Boursier also became very famous through what I'm told is a very bad commercial French film called Profs, and he was known as an actor as well as a political theorist. This scene here is, I believe, based on one of the letters that was written after the journalistic report was published about people, and particularly women, living in these new high rises on the outskirts of Paris. Basically, it was all about how these women, such as this woman here, in this rather broadly played scene, were so enamored of their new luxuries, such as taking long baths, that they would spend hours and hours in this sort of reverie of luxury. Of course, the downside of this, and what the film traces as a social phenomenon, is that at a certain point, of course, living in this high life of consumerism led to running out of money, and that the women, sometimes with their husband's consent, sometimes without the husband's knowing, would move into prostitution. Now, prostitution, as any Godard fan knows, is one of his obsessions. On all levels, I would say, it's one of his obsessions. Films, the earlier film like Vivre sa vie, and a later film like Sauve qui peut, or Every Man for Himself, as it's known in English, are all films that in different ways use the image, the metaphor, and the reality of prostitution. At this time, 1966, Godard said that this film, Two or Three Things, allowed him to express one of his pet theories, which was, in order to live in society in Paris today, on no matter what social level, one is forced to prostitute oneself in one way or another. Or to put it another way, to live under conditions resembling those of prostitution. So prostitution, basically, selling yourself, selling your talent, selling your soul, as well as your body, for money, for survival, is for Godard the basic metaphor that explains society. And indeed, in this period, 66, he was involved in a lengthy television debate about prostitution. And it was something that has marked his career, indeed also his life, all the way along. This film, this scene rather, that we're watching here, is a sort of a droll commentary on this new economy of prostitution. This pleasant-looking guy obviously runs this kind of way station, sort of looking after the kids, while the housewives from the new suburbs who are coming into Paris now to do their work, while they go off to do their prostitution. And you'll see the rooms full of tourist posters, which of course is another sign of this consumer society, the unreal dreams of consumer society. And also a painting on the wall, which is a painting from an image from Godard's earlier film, Vivre sa vie, about prostitution. So he himself makes that link between the works. That shot we just saw is a very beautiful Godardian image of seeing something outside a window, through a window. In fact, it's worth giving you at this point a little breakdown of how Godard himself saw this movie. He said that, as I mentioned before, that it was an attempt to show, to describe, to analyse modern life, or a particular facet of modern life. And we could say that it's a film much more of description, of an essay and of a description, rather than a narrative. And so Godard said that his schema of this essay, of this description, occurs in 4 movements. This is at least the idea that he worked to. He said the first level of the film, or the first movement of the film, is objective description. And he meant by that objective description of objects, of things, of the packets of washing powder, of buildings, cars, and so on. And also of subjects, meaning of people. And in some ways, treating people as objects. The second level or movement of the film, Godard said, was subjective description. In other words, to give a sense of emotions, of feelings. The feelings that we have when we look at objects, and also the feelings that the subject, let's just say, the people, the individuals feel. And he said he wanted to do that through scenes that were written and acted. And he said he also wanted to show what the world looks like from the inside, and his example is through a window, from the viewpoint of someone who is at home looking at the world, perhaps longingly or frustratedly, through a window. This is something that years later would become the centre of an extraordinary film that Godard made, a very bleak film, once again about life in these sorts of outer suburbs of Paris, a film called Number 2, which is all shot on video and is presented as a series of small TV screens. We see the action through these TV screens in the middle of the vast 35mm screen. A really extraordinary film, that one, and it continues in many ways what Godard started, the particular analysis of modern life that he started in 2 or 3 things. Back to Godard's list, he said that the third level of this movie is what he called the search for structures. And he said that that's the other 2, objective description and subjective description, put together. He said it's the sum of the objective and the subjective, and that should lead to the discovery of more global forms, or what he called a complex feeling. And this word complex refers to, is a play on words that we can have in English as well as French, because we refer to something that is complex, and we refer to an apartment complex. And it's the same in French with the word ensemble, which means being together, 2 people together, whatever it might be, a community together. And it also refers to a high-rise, is referred to as a grand ensemble, a big high-rise apartment building. And so Godard said that he was searching for structures. He wanted to see what were the structures that determined the lives of individuals. That is to say, the economic structures, the social structures, the structures of the media, and of consumption and of sales and so on. So interestingly, about 12 years after he made this film, it's one of his films that he looks back on with great fondness. He doesn't always do that with his movies. But with this film, Godard said that he was trying to understand modern communications. And by that, he didn't just mean communications between people, and he didn't just mean the mass media communication. But he also said that the reason he filmed so many roads and highways in the film is that they are the routes of communication. They're the passages of communication that are going to take people to work and back home and so on. And that for him, the highway was a modern structure, a structure of modern life, on par with television or radio or cinema or advertising, or any of these other structures. So he was looking for what he called a complex feeling, but he added that in a way the goal is to try to live harmoniously in the world. This is something we'll come back to. But of course, he added, it's hard to live harmoniously in a world that that is itself without harmony, that is an unbalanced world where the relation between needs and wants and social structures, individual lives is completely out of whack, completely askew. So once again, two or three things. This film is about alienation, but it's also about, for what for Godard is a positive possibility. It's like if you could see the structures of modern life through this film, that would be a good thing. That would be a positive thing. It would allow you to somewhat escape from the weight of all of this alienation and misery. Godard ended his list of the four movements or the four structures by saying that if you put objective description, subjective description, and structures together, you will end up with life itself. A slightly grandiose ambition on Godard's part there, but he meant it. And he said that finally what he wanted to do in this film was to convey the singular existence of a person, particularly this person, Juliet, played by Marina Vladi, but to show her life in context, not just her life from the inside, but also from the outside, and within a whole social context. And in a way, one can judge the success or failure of the film on that level. Let's talk a bit about Marina Vladi. I think more and more that I look at this film, that her performance in this film is really something extraordinary. She was, as I say, an actor that Godard had never worked with, and very different to some of Godard's other actors like Anna Karina or Jean-Pierre Léaud, or in films such as Vivre sa vie and Masculine and Feminine. Marina Vladi was never fazed by Godard. That is to say, she didn't act out of nervousness, out of nervous tension, out of being ill at ease. Godard gave her an enormously difficult acting job in this film, because the kind of character that Juliet is and the kind of performance that Vladi has to give happens on at least three levels at once. She has to be a character within scenes, having dialogues, normal conversations. She has to speak a kind of a stream of consciousness, like she speaks her thoughts, often in a very surreal way, full of non sequiturs and so on, all through the movie. And at the same time, Godard was using one of his most famous techniques. He had a little speaker in Vladi's ear, and he was whispering both comments that he wanted her to speak and also giving her questions that she would have to answer somehow in character, as the character of Juliet. So the more you watch Vladi, you realise that she's doing this unbelievable high-wire act where she's completely acting in the moment. She has lines to learn, she has things being thrown at her through her ear by Godard. She has to relate to other actors, she's relating to the spaces in which she finds herself, because they're all real spaces. There are no sets that Godard or his collaborators built for this film. It's all, of course, real locations. And she never loses her cool once in this movie, even in an extraordinary scene near the end of the movie where these kids that she's working with are completely out of control. Actually, here is one of my favourite moments in the film. To define myself, one word: indifference. Right, so that's one of these strange, like, stream of consciousness comments that she's perhaps was prompted by Godard to say, or perhaps was written for her to say. And at the very moment she says it, she has to be completely natural, like she's walking into a bar and she's about to talk to her friend, and so on. I think in many ways, part of the strength of this movie comes from really the extraordinarily dexterous performance of Marina Vladi. This was, of course, a very strange film for her to make in this period of her career. I just mentioned a second ago that Godard didn't build sets or didn't involve himself in that level of artifice. There are very few movies that he ever shot on constructed sets. But what of course, Godard was in some ways in total control of was colour, and of course framing, the way he framed shots and filmed shots with his famous collaborator, the cinematographer Raoul Coutard. This film is some of Coutard's really most extraordinary work, because what Coutard and Godard were working on was essentially the question of a colour palette. We saw in the credits the red, white and blue of various national flags. And red, white and blue are just some of the dominant colours in the film. And it's clear that places that Coutard and Godard and their other collaborators chose, like the dress shop earlier, like these various bars that we see in the film, like the walls that people stand in front of in the street, are all chosen in terms of this incredible palette of primary colours, the red, white, blue, and some other colours too, because he shifts the palette around in terms of what he wants to do with it. And so you get the impression of an incredibly intensely art-directed or production designed film, but which in fact is Godard, and he was particularly good at this, I think, of choosing bits of reality, literally corners of rooms, sections of streets, angles from which to film the world that made it seem like it was an incredibly designed aesthetic concept that he'd started out with. Indeed, it's interesting in terms of the way Godard films Paris. Now we're in the centre or near the centre of Paris here in the film, because the housewives who are prostitutes come into the city to do that work. That's an important detail in the film that's easy to miss. And one critic, the American critic Brian Henderson, once wrote a really perceptive thing about this movie. He compared it to an earlier Godard film, Alphaville, which is a science fiction film, but in which Godard filmed the most futuristic-looking things in Paris in 1965, the gadgets, the new architecture, and so on. And he also referred to a short film that Godard made in a film called Rogopag, and which has a similar idea of filming Paris as it is and calling it the future. But in this film, Two or Three Things, Henderson says that the film presents a Paris of its day that is already the future and is becoming more so, and that he avoided shooting things that look like the old Paris. And Henderson says this is a very dialectical concept between the present and the future, that in many ways is really the heart of this movie, that the present tense of this time in 1966 is already the future. There's no time for the present to stop. There's no time for people to live in the present because of consumerism, because of social forces. They're hurtling towards their future. Now we're looking at this point at one of the most famous canonical moments of modern cinema, I would say, the famous coffee cup of Two or Three Things. We're going to move closer and closer into this coffee cup, and in some ways you can read this whole scene in this bar in two different ways, because on the one hand, of course, it's a scene about isolation. It's about people who are completely cut off from each other. And you can take this sort of vision here, this incredible vision of looking into the cup of coffee as like the ultimate in solipsism of the individual reduced to his or her own perception, totally in themselves, looking at the tiny little object in front of them. But on the other hand, of course, the words that Godard whispers as he whispers the entire voice track of his narration in the film. In some ways, when we get right into this coffee and its bubbles and the swirling shapes, this little object contains the universe. You can see the galaxies in it. You can see the whole world in it. You can have a reverie that opens you up out of your loneliness, out of the alienation, out of, in this scene, all these people sort of giving each other strange and uncertain looks, are you a prostitute? Will you be my client? All of these intrigues are sort of hinted at in the film. And then we go into this coffee cup, which has often been taken as an emblem of modern cinema, that you can go right into something and open out its meaning, take an ordinary object of daily life, and totally open out its poetic meaning. Godard, in fact, complained later that Coutard, his cinematographer, he could hardly sell Coutard on the idea of this shot. Coutard couldn't see how this shot would work, how it could possibly fit into the scene, what it could possibly mean or give to the film. and indeed, she'll see he has some problems focusing the shot. It's a very intense bit of micro photography here. But Godard's intuitions, of course, were right, that there's so much seems to be summed up in this incredible image, this almost sort of space age image. And that looks forward to something that Godard would do in the 80s and in the 90s, where he would often have, we could say, cosmic imagery, the planets and so on. It became of intense significance to him. Here's a beautiful segment of Two or Three Things. After the coffee cup, I'll read you Brian Henderson. He says, this passage, the repeated shots of Vladi walking, this passage suggests a rising up out of the coffee cup and the isolation and immobility of the cafe, a rising up from that into motion, space and joy. And I truly do think that that Godard's filmic language here really does give you a great sense with the Beethoven string quartet, the images repeated. It's a truly lyrical moment. You know, I think another way of understanding Two or Three Things is to think about some of the influences, that the intellectual and the cultural influences that were on Godard's mind at this time in the mid-60s. Because that idea that that Juliette, Marina Vladi, has this walk, and for that moment she feels like she's really living in the world, that she's in the world and she's at one with the world. It's an idea that goes through this film, Two or Three Things, about which is called consciousness, not conscience as it's sometimes translated, but consciousness. And in many ways, consciousness or sensibility is a matter of mood. It's like Godard is trying to find these epiphanies, these sort of magic moments where you or I or his fictional character will feel like they're part of the world. These moments where mood changes, where suddenly the world is not so grey, it's not so oppressive, and where suddenly you feel like you're part of that new world that we spoke of before, this whole new world of movement, colour and sound. In many ways, this was a sort of a dream or an ideal, a sort of a utopian idea that Godard himself was to abandon some years later. He would later critique this film and a lot of his earlier films as being too obsessed with this notion of individual consciousness or mood, as I'm calling it. That in really, Godard would come to the position that to really understand the world, you had to get more outside of individual experience, sort of downplay the role of the individual. But what's interesting in Two or Three Things is it's really on the cusp of, he's starting to get a bit disinterested in individuals and stories about characters. And he's starting to get more interested in these social structures that are over and above individuals. But this film really has room for both things. It's a film that's sometimes dismissed as being the first of Godard's films where the characters don't really work as anything but mouthpieces for Godard's own ideas and theories, and slogans and quotations. And I confess that was, I think, my first reaction to this film when I saw it years ago, that there was something a little dry about it, something inhuman about the film. But the more I've watched it, I really think there's a strange sort of tenderness in this movie, and a lot of that has to do with, which I think, with the casting, because Godard for this film really gave up a certain sort of cast that he used. He was no longer casting Carina or Jean-Pierre Léaud. He wasn't using those new wave stars. He was using a lot of people that he'd never used before, including Marina Vladi. He was using a lot of ordinary people who he gets to sort of speak about their ordinary lives in the film. Some of them may be talking from their own experience, some of it may be written by Godard. We don't exactly know in each case. And Godard was also, in this period, 66, getting involved with a whole new social group, basically. And it was a social group of young people. And Wiazemsky, who we would later marry, Juliette Berthaud, who we see later in the film. This young chap in the scene, these were all a sort of a group of people who would eventually sort of share the experiences of May '68 with Godard. Another one of the people that we'll see later in the film is a woman named Blondie Jensen, who was very important. The film La Chinoise, it was in fact filmed in her apartment, and she was often a comrade of Godard through the political years of the late '60s and the early '70s. And so he was trying to break away from earlier films that he'd made that had a lot of quotations from other films, from Hollywood films and art films. He was in fact trying to get closer to some sort of social reality here, and he was also trying to, as he says, feel it a little bit from the inside to understand what is this world like for these people who live in it. Now, it's possible to look at this movie and go, maybe Godard doesn't know so much about ordinary people, and some of these supposedly ordinary people we see almost come off like caricatures of themselves, caricatures of working people, working women, and so on. But I think we have to give Godard the benefit of the doubt on this, because I think it's true what he says, that a comment that he made at the time of making the film, that he said he wanted to give the feeling through this movie that he was sometimes very close to people, very close to the people that he was filming. And I think there are some particular parts of this film where that is a really successful strategy. Very unusually, given that, of course, Marina Vladi's character, who's speaking in the stream of consciousness that we discussed before, is nothing like an ordinary fictional three-dimensional character. She is a sort of an emblem, a figure of the modern woman. But Godard still manages to get a strange sort of tenderness into this film. As I say, it's good to think about, it's useful to think about some of the influences that were on Godard's mind at the time. We've mentioned the sociologist, Raymond Aron, and his theories of industrial society. Also incredibly important to Godard at this period, it would soon be not very important to him, is a certain branch of intellectual philosophy known as phenomenology, particularly to do with perception. In the case of this film, individual perception. How do we speak? What are the words we use? How does that condition or influence the way we experience the world? As I say, there's a touch of intense sort of individualism in this question of finding the right mood, achieving the right mood in Godard's involvement with this phenomenological approach to the world. For instance, the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who he was fond of quoting in this period. But he was mixing that with other things. He was mixing it with sociology, with this analysis of the consumer society, particularly as it was being developed by the very hard-line theorists of the situationist movement. And you can see very much a kinship between this movie, Two or Three Things, and the most famous book of the situationist movement, which is a book called The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. That little boy we saw earlier, Christophe Boursier, ended up writing a biography of Guy Debord. And I think actually Godard became more and more influenced right to this day by Guy Debord's work, and also the example of his life and his art, because Guy Debord was an incredibly hardline avant-garde filmmaker. So Godard was sort of swimming in all of these influences, and also a very particular mid-60s trend, which is called structuralism, but a very particular sort of structuralism. I think people think of structuralism meaning different things, whether it's film studies or literary studies, but particularly Godard was interested in a sort of a social structuralism. And indeed, in a statement, a press release that he did at the time of making this film, he said he wanted the film to understand her, and her is many things in the film. Her is the character Juliette. Her is this region of Paris that we're seeing. Her is Paris itself, the city, and her is also what Godard said, the Gestapo of structures. These social structures of the economy, of advertising, and so on, that are determining modern life. And in many ways, this was this dream of Godard's to be able to grab these structures. And in this period, the mid-60s, there was a lot of writers in different fields who were taken up with this idea that you could define absolutely the structures of the world, the structures of language, the structures of experience, the structures of art, the structures of narrative. It was a slightly mad period on that level of thinking that one could capture the absolute. Indeed, at the time, one of the criticisms of this film by the very remarkable critic Marie-Claire Ropar, this film, Two or Three Things, was not Ropar's favourite Godard movie, and she said that in a way Godard was too interested in the absolute, too interested in trying to pin everything down, and that he was losing track of what had made his earlier films, such as Contempt and Pure Le Fou, so vital, which was, as Ropar understood it, was this constantly fleeting sense of the present moment, of the lyricism of the present moment. And on the one hand, there was a temptation to telling stories, and on the other hand, there was this sort of intellectual temptation to nail down the truth of the world, the absolute truth of society from a roughly Marxist perspective. And Ropar saw this film as the problem of this film being that the whole film is a kind of an illustration of what Godard is saying on the soundtrack. It's an illustration of very set, very concrete, very structural ideas. And indeed, when we remember Godard's breaking down of the four levels, the four movements of the film, that's a very, very structural gesture of his at the time, to think that one could go into a film in such a predetermined way. This is a much more predetermined film than, let's say, Vivre sa vie or any number of Godard's earlier films. He's got very precise ideas about what he wants to explore here, and sometimes those very precise ideas can flatten the richness of this or that detail. Two or Three Things is a somewhat uneven film, I think, and each of us would have our favourite scenes and our less favourite scenes in it. As I say, there are some moments, and we've just seen one, where a supposed ordinary person almost is like a caricature of herself. But this scene that we're watching now, this is really one of the great parts of the film, because it really is devoted to this idea of how are we going to phenomenologically give an image, a sound of what it is to live in the modern world. So, of course, Godard, with his usual skill, picks this garage, painted in these amazing pop art colours. And every object, every shot in this scene is just so beautifully done at the level of, he's trying to bring out, Godard's trying to make you really see every single object, the red car, the gas pumps, the paraphernalia in the garage. And to give you an image of what it is to live this subjectively, be part of the scene, as Juliet is, he does all these great tricks with the editing, repeating shots, repeating movements, finding these unusual sorts of movements, like this movement right now. And it really is a scene devoted to this poetry of everyday life in a very intense way. Incredible work, as always, on the sound. The relation between sound and silence, very intense in this film. Sound, silence, and noise, outright noise. That sort of music concrete of of all of the building that's going on, the construction of the highways. The film was famously noisy at the time it was released. It's one of those movies you really should play at top volume, because Godard wanted you to suffer the noise of the modern world, of the modern industrial world. But he also wanted to compare that to these very lyrical, very poetic passages of silence, and of Godard's own whisper, which for some is an annoying, but for me, an effective part of this film. He doesn't want to do a standard voiceover narration that's telling you what to think and what to see. In fact, Godard described the film as he wanted to let you into his processes. He wanted to let you hear what he's thinking, all of the choices that he's making. This scene is all about that. He's asking himself, should I film this or that? Is it adequate? Is it right? Is it expressive enough? Is it true to the character? What I'm showing now? Should I be showing something else? There's a slight edge of almost a kind of despair, a sort of a philosophical, existential, phenomenological despair to this sort of process of, as he says now, in images anything goes. I can show this, I can show that. I can put on music, I can put on noise, I can put on sound. It reminds me personally of that great Bob Dylan song where he says there's a restless, hungry feeling that doesn't mean no one any good when everything that I'm saying, you can say it just as good. And that's very much sort of a very mid-60s feeling that Godard is experiencing here. Once again, an almost solipsistic feeling, a very interior feeling, a problem of mood, sometimes a bad mood, because there's this idea that one word is as good as another. One image is as good as another. Godard often said in this period that the whole problem for him was when he shoots something, does he leave the camera on or does he turn it off? Should he be filming something else instead of what he's filming right now? And this was a sort of an agony for him. An agony that really he had to transcend. He had to get past this agony because, of course, it'd be hard to make films if you continued on this level of self-consciousness, of this self-conscious, self-interrogating agony of, how do I show this? How do I show anything? And in some ways, his personal way of resolving the problem was really to get more into politics and to get more of an external view of the world, to sort of leave behind these questions of personal experience, of sensibility, of consciousness, of personal mood, and so on. But two or three things is valuable for the way that it puts us right inside this moment of doubt. As Godard said, we're going to hear him thinking in this movie. We're going to hear the doubts. We're going to see the options. He's going to show us one thing and then another, and then say, what's the right one? And in the film, I think insofar as it touches us, it can touch us artistically or poetically. It's because, I think all of us have had that kind of feeling of not only of, what's the use, but how can I express something? How can I really express something that's true to my experience, true to anyone's experience, true to the modern world that we're living in? Once again, we come back to this theme of the new world, of the new industrial world, which is problematic in so many ways for Godard, but which also is a kind of a sensual experience. It gives you a new feast for the senses. Even though the noise is giving you a headache, it's ear-splitting, it's still a kind of music for Godard. It's the music of the city. It's just like the futurists were saying, that the pylons and the gas pumps are beautiful. Let's turn them into art. Let's see them as art in everyday life. It's one of the major things in modern art is to see the sort of detritus of everyday life, just the stuff on the street, and say that, well, there's art right there. You don't even need to put it in a gallery. The gas pump is art. And Godard has a similar way of approaching those things in this film. I mentioned before the analysis of the situationist philosophers, writers, critics, political theorists, and one book that's really worth consulting on this film is a recent book by Douglas Moray called Jean-Luc Godard, published by Manchester University Press, and he has a great analysis of the way this film chimes in with the theories of Guy Debord. He says that for Debord, in his book Society of Spectacle, that book described the serial logic of merchandise, of the consumer society, of advertising and buying, in terms of a fascist dictatorship. And this, in fact, was one of Godard's slogans in this mid-60s period, that advertising is a form of fascism. That's a line that's in the film Made in USA. Moray goes on summarising the opinions of Debord. Each new consumer product must present itself as sovereign, as absolutely singular, and thus absolutely desirable. Yet, In order to satisfy the desire of the consumer, the product has to be mass-produced, such that as soon as it enters into our possession, we recognise it for what it is, a vulgar, commonplace object. Thus, we pass from one object to the next in pursuit of the promised land of total consumption. So for De Boer, sort of consumerism was a big lie, but even more seriously than that, it kind of gave us a very warped sense of time and of experience, that we're always living in this sort of false present, waiting for the new consumer good, then living with the sort of the dissatisfaction, the disappointment of the consumer good, and then getting hooked on the promise of the next one. And for Guy Debord, this put us in this really unreal, eternal present, a present that you can't, in fact, live. You can't live in it because it's unreal. It's profoundly unreal. Moray goes on in his book. He says, if it is difficult for us to know with certainty anything about a given moment in time, it's because our attention is always being directed towards the next moment, the next major product launch, next year's holiday, next season's cultural highlights. The serial production of merchandise creates a linear, irreversible sense of time that always appears several steps of those who are trying to live in it. That's something that profoundly goes all through two or three things. Even the images that many critics have commented on, the gas pump, the numbers on the gas pump, sometimes seem to evoke for us a clock that's sort of spinning wildly out of control, or a calendar that's spinning wildly out of control. Moray had a mention there of like a constructed time, this prison of social time. That is to say, for instance, holidays or weekends. That, you know, we work 5 days a week, and then we rest on the weekend, and then we're ready for the working week again. Or, you know, we take our yearly holiday, and then we're ready to work again. This is something that fascinated and I think obsessed Godard, was this notion that, once again, a very structural idea. In fact, there was a political book of the 60s called the Prison of Measured Time, and that was a very sad description of industrial capitalist society, that all our time is used up, and that all time, all experience is basically to keep the system running, to keep the industrial system running, the workplace and so on. And that personal life, the life that you or I want to lead, that we dream of leading, and that the dreams are fed by the cinema, by the ads and so on. We have to force our life into these very small little windows of time, the evenings, the weekends, the holidays. It's something from very early on Godard had a sense of, that in a way he was against, and that he wanted to expose. As early as 63 or 64, Godard used the example of travelling on a plane. He said, when people go on a holiday and they're in the plane over to Spain, they think when they're in the plane, they're not living, they're not on holiday yet. Once they hit the ground, boom, the holiday starts, and then back on the plane, they're no longer on holiday, they're going back home. Of course, this whole film is constructed around such a prison of measured time. The time that's spent in Paris, the time of the evening, we'll see later near the end of the film. There's a whole discussion precisely about this question of how do you live in time when time is, for instance, the evening. You have to go to sleep, you've got to rest up for the next day. Where does that leave the time for instance, sexuality, for love, for tenderness, even for raising your children? Because that's something in this film that's unusual for Godard, is the attention to children. Very few Godard films have children in them. And the ones he uses here are kind of, in some ways, symbols of this energy, this life energy that you can't fit within the prison of measured time. You can't fit it in the clean structures of the capitalist industrial world. This scene here is, of course, one of Godard's great anti-American moments. The guy who's playing a character with the wonderful name of John Bogus, his name in real life is Raoul Levy, and he was the guy who directed a couple of films in the 60s, including a film called The Spy, in which Godard appeared in. He was an unusual figure between the mainstream cinema and the more adventurous cinema of the new wave of Godard. In fact, killed himself not very long after this film was shot. And he of course, represents the ugly American for Godard in this film. That's what he plays. And in Godard's films from the mid-60s on, there are more and more of these characters of the ugly Americans. In some ways, this reaches a pinnacle in one of Godard's more recent films, In Praise of Love, in which, in some ways, Steven Spielberg or his representatives become the symbol of the ugly American as well as the ugly Hollywood industry of cinema. This part of the scene in Two or Three Things that we're watching now, it's a scene that very much puts me in mind of what in a few years' time would be a sort of a classic text and also a famous television program called Ways of Seeing, made by the English writer John Berger. And in that book, and I'm sure Berger was very influenced by Godard, but Berger in his book and on his TV show talked about the tearing contradiction in the pages of every magazine. He said, on one column, you've got pictures of atrocities, napalm victims, the war in Vietnam, all of the various sort of armed struggles that were going on during the world at that time, the wars and so on. You've got the most hideous pictures of atrocities in one column or on one page of your magazine, your Saturday glossy colour supplement, and then next to it, there's an ad for a consumer product, a soap or detergent or whatever it is, promising you, healthier skin, better sex life, more fun, and so on and so forth. And Berger says in both the show and the book of Ways of Seeing that, how do any of us live with this contradiction? How do we become accustomed to that we can just dissociate so intensely that we no longer see the contradiction between the photo of the atrocity and the ad on the next page? I think this scene was probably an influence on Berger's analysis because in some ways it's playing out the eruption of these images of atrocity into the mind of the character and also into our consciousness as we view the film. And we can see, I think, in this scene that Godard's attempt to understand what we're calling consciousness, sensibility and mood is, of course, more and more infiltrated, invaded by these atrocities, these political atrocities of the world, of reality. One of the great experts on Godard, the French critic Alain Bergala, he made an interesting comment on this film's use of prostitution in his piece, where he notes the importance of prostitution in Godard's work. He says that Godard is prostitution is always about an invasion of the woman. In other words, the will of the man, the sex of the man, is something that's sort of brutally forced. So it's all about invasion, about penetration in all senses of the word. It's an oppressive force. And then politics, of course, for instance, the American involvement in Vietnam also follows this model of the invasion, the disgusting sort of penetrative force. That's one of the reasons that prostitution became such an intense metaphor for Godard in this period and in other periods of his career. But it's different, say, to Vivre sa vie, where prostitution also tends to have a more personal sort of psychosexual meaning for Godard. It's much more about the abyss between men and women, the relationship between men and women, on a slightly more personalised way. By the time of this film, Two or Three Things, we've entered into another kind of analysis now. We don't have so much, I don't sense in this film, Godard's personal sort of psychosexual problems working themselves out in relation to the actress's filming, as this definitely is the case in Vivre sa vie. This film, this scene in the film is another moment where it's a very Godardian scene. It's based on a collage of different things happening in this cafe restaurant here. The young woman who we just saw is Juliette Berthaud. She has an incredibly important place in the history of modern French cinema. She started acting in films by Godard, including La Chinoise and this film. She was in a whole bunch of his films to come. She also became a director and directed a number of films. She also became, we could say, a fetish actress for the new wave director Jacques Rivette, and she was in a number of his most famous films, including Celine and Julie Gauboding and the massive epic film Out One. Berthaud was a truly amazing actor who took her performance completely away from naturalism. For her, it was never a question of playing some real psychological individual, which I think it still is for Marina Vladi. I think Marina Vladi is working with all these different factors. As she said, she's quoting, she's like a Brechtian actor, but she's also trying to really live as this fictional character, this real person within the story, Juliet. And Vladi says that's what she tried to do, was to give her a real sense of this person, this person in this world. For Juliette Berthaud, acting is never about giving a real sense of a real person in the world. It's about, she has an incredible style of pantomime acting, awful pouting, gestures, are always mesmerising. And she pushes her acting much more towards theatrical farce, pretense, play acting. That's what she would really develop in her work with Rivette. But it's already in her work with Godard too. She's in this film and in La Chinoise. This scene is important in Godard's career and the development of the career, because it's this sort of exploration, kind of sociological exploration of sexuality, particularly of female sexuality. That's something that he'd started doing in Masculine, Feminine, and in The Married Woman. It's sort of like questionnaires or interview scenes where women are asked, how do you feel about your body? How do you feel about having sex? We get these sort of very dry questions that don't really elicit very personal or true or adequate answers. And Godard described this scene as being a kind of provocation that he wanted to put this figure played by Juliette Berthaud into a scene in which she's confronted with the question, say that your sex is between your legs, your sexuality is between your legs. And of course the response is to go, why should I say that? What do you want me to say that for? She reacts defensively. But of course Juliette Berthaud, as a performer, both plays a sort of a defensive, ordinary woman, but she's also completely in control of the frame and the space, and she looks at the camera. There's this whole other level going on. As I mentioned before, Juliette Berthaud was one of these new people, the really new blood that Godard was bringing into his films at this time. Very much involved with their sort of burgeoning student movement, much more political analysis of the world. That Juliette Berthaud was in a social scene that included Henri Zemsky and other people that Godard would go on to work with. This scene's also amusing because of the role of the husband figure, who is a fairly blank figure in the film. We see him involved in almost the kind of theatrical sort of agitprop setup of listening on his ham radio and, as it were, deciphering the secret messages of American governmental power. And he's kind of the channel for that, just like the two guys with their books are sort of channel for various quotations. And he seems almost completely dissociated, disconnected from the story of his wife, Juliette, her work as a prostitute, her feelings in everyday life, and so on. Of course, Godard doesn't allow us to sort of enter that guy, the husband's sort of consciousness. He doesn't try to give him a full objective and subjective experience the way that he does with Juliette. So he remains in many ways a figure on the side of the film, literally outside of the frame of the film during this part. Just a little word about those other guys, the guys at the table who are reading the books, picking books at random and reading passages out. At the time and ever since, this was taken as almost Godard's joke about his own method. his own method of filmmaking, which often followed a kind of collage. In other words, just picking up a book, using a bit of text, thinking of a film and copying a shot from the film. Whatever was to hand, as Godard often said, he used what was to hand, and he drew his inspiration from what was around. And those two characters at the table are modelled on characters that the Gustave Flaubert wrote about, the two guys named Bouvard and Pessuchet. And those two characters of Flaubert's are basically, as Flaubert wrote them, they're sort of comic characters. They're idiots, because all they do is just channel received opinion, received wisdom. Everything that they quote or that they cite or that they learn and pass from one to the other is just sort of like social garbage, just sort of the cliches of the media, of literature, of trash fiction, of whatever it may be, of advertising. And so Godard's versions of those characters by Flaubert, of course, just picking one paperback after another, because in many ways paperbacks are for Godard sort of the cultural detritus of the world, all of the received wisdom and so on will be there. This part of the film is for me one of the most beguiling and strangest parts. The woman is this person I mentioned before, another one of the young people that Godard became involved with at this time. Her name is Blondie Jensen. And she would be involved in quite a number of Godard's subsequent films, including Weekend, where she plays Emily Bronte, the historical director. This scene where she's interviewing what we're told is Ivanov, the Nobel Prize winner. Well, I can tell you for a fact there is no Nobel Prize winner named Ivanov. This guy is an actor. He was, in fact, a very mainstream kind of actor. He was not associated with the French New Wave. He went on to a career on television and so on. And he's basically a bland, sort of good-looking guy type actor who got cast as this sort of distant intellectual who's full of the utopias of communism, of the communist world. Now, what Godard opposes to this sort of rather comic figure, I think, is Blondine. As a very young student, she was like 17 years old or something in this film. And she's interviewing him, but it's an extremely charged interview. It's an extremely personal scene. There's all sorts of unusual sort of nervousness in Blondie Jensen. There's sort of a tenderness in the way Godard films her and films her shyness, her embarrassment, and her confessions of being depressed, of crying, of the sadness of life. Of course, it's a character that we haven't seen before and we'll never see again. But I feel it's one of the scenes where Godard did somewhat succeed in giving us just a glimpse of this sort of subjectively lived reality within this broader world of political chaos, political structures, and the battle between the grand global battle between capitalism and communism. And of course, this guy, he stands for the completely almost heartless intellectual, his pipe and all the rest of it. He can't reach out to this girl at all, and you sort of feel that strange sort of ache in the scene that happens across the cutting here from him to her. I mentioned some of the people involved in the crew. Of course, Godard credits none of the crew in the film's home credits, but apart from Aurel Coutard, the cinematographer, one of the other names that's really worth crediting and remembering in this film is the sound team. Because we've noted how important sound is in Godard's works. Really, absolutely, is every bit as important as the image. And that what he does with the image, the collage of different angles, textures, so on, is exactly what he does on the soundtrack. And he sets the image and sound collages then against each other in an incredible kind of polyphony. And the two main people who are involved with the soundtrack of the film are His recording whiz, René Lévert, who also recorded the sound for masculine and feminine, and his mixer, Antoine Bonfanti, who recently died. And Bonfanti at this time, in the mid-60s, was sort of the young Turk of the sound mixing industry. He went on to work with many radical directors such as Chris Marker and others. And there was in a diary that Godard wrote at this time called 30,000 Hours of Cinema, a very revealing personal document by Godard. At one point he talked about the fact that he made these two films at the same time. As we mentioned, he made the Made in USA film and Two or Three Things I Know About Her. And that, for Made in USA, he used sound mixer Jacques Aumont, who he used on other work, and Two or Three Things he used Antoine Bonfanti. And what he credited to Bonfanti's youth and his exuberance and his energy was that he said, as a sound mixer, Bonfanti knows that there are certain noises and musics that only begin to exist when they are saturated. And he said that what Bonfanti understood is in a sound collage or a sound mix or a sound design, as we would say these days, that no sound in that mix is ever definitive. And that what Bonfanti was a genius at doing is mixing relations between sounds, not sounds that are singular objects in themselves. I think that gives you a lot of insight into the sound work on this movie. On the one hand, you've got René Lévert, who records sounds with incredible precision, so that you really get the texture, the incredible tangible, sensual texture of the sound that things make. And then you've got Bonfanti, who brings in this extraordinary mixing process, where, as Godard says, he mixes the relations between sounds and the saturations of sounds, because there's a lot of scenes in this movie where we get a cacophony of sound, a lot of sounds at once, the industrial noise, the whispered narration, the sounds of dialogue in a scene, the snatches of music, those tiny little bits of Beethoven, which only appear in very punctual moments of the film. And Bonfanti can mix them in such a way that, once again, we as it were hear the structure. We hear the whole structure of the soundtrack, of the sound design, in the way that he can saturate these noises and musics, as Godard said. The scene that we just watched is one of the several tiny vignettes of the life of a prostitute, or the life of a housewife that we see in the film. Almost like comedy moments in the film, like strange moments of farce. For instance, the woman in her bath, or here the quickie, the guy in the basement. But now we enter this sort of final movement of the film, which is where we come out of Paris and we go back to the Sarcelles section on the outskirts of Paris. And this is in many ways the sort of closing and the summing up of the film. Even though there isn't deliberately not much of a storyline, of a fiction in this film, actually it's the kind of film that makes you think, well, what is a fiction? And usually a storyline, a fiction, is where you start with a situation and then something complicated happens. There's some trouble, or there's some disturbance, or there's something unusual introduced into the everyday world of the characters, which then they have to deal with or solve, or try to return to equilibrium, to the original state of their everyday life. That's what a lot of stories are, follow that structure. With Godard, of course, basically he shows us a 24 hours that is exactly the same as every other 24 hours in the lives of these characters. In that sense, it's a sort of an iterative story, in the sense that it will just repeat the same way over and over again. And then so once again, he's showing you this prison of time, this Gestapo structure of social life and of daily life. And by the time we get to this scene in the film, you get that sort of double feeling of the incredible oppressiveness of this, the high-rise apartments and the ensemble living. But there's something else that insists, because of this space that's given to Marina Vladi, to Juliet as a character, that she has some space to reflect, to have some sort of sensibility, to have some sort of personal experience, to feel that her mood in some way affects the exterior world around her. In many ways, that's the whole tension that drives this movie. Is that sometimes we like to think that our feelings, our inner moods, our personal determinations can change the world around us, can affect the world. And so we enter, in a way, the interior of this character, the interior of her mind and some of her feelings. But, of course, there's a real doubt, like, can she change the world around her in any way, shape or form, other than having that little moment earlier in the film of that sort of epiphany of walking and with the Beethoven around her and everything like that, suddenly feeling the wind in the trees, what it's like to be in the street. That's really as far as action gets. That's precisely why the story is no story in this film, because there's no action that a character can take against the world or on the world to actually change it. To have a story happening, you would have to somehow organise that sort of action in and against the world. But this film, Two or Three Things I Know About It, is of course a circular movie. We're going to go through the 24 hours, and we're basically going to end where we started. We're going to end with the man and the woman, and we're going to come back to the domestic scene of the children. I mentioned before that the children rarely appear in Godard's films. When they do, Godard is intensely interested in this question of basically how does a family live together in a box, in a box which is an apartment, usually an apartment in his films. It's never an expansive house in the country or anything like that. It's always a very urban, confined, constricted kind of box. Of course, this film is full of box-like structures, and indeed we could do a whole study of urban architecture through this movie. I mean, that's one of the things that the film both lyrically and very coolly describes, is precisely the shapes of the modern world, the shapes of this new urbanism, of the new high-rise architecture of the mid-60s. And of course, I think literally a lot of the structures that were built at this time would still be standing in one form or another, perhaps in a deteriorated form, in this part of Paris today. Now we're back to the boy, Christophe Bossert. Children often have a very powerful and sort of extreme and unreal role in Godard's films. They're full of visions, of stories. They channel strange sorts of visions. In fact, I'd say they're almost like visionary characters. Earlier, of course, this boy had the vision of North and South Vietnam, being united in the one body. Here is this whole thing that he tells. He's reading from his school book, and it's basically this strange sort of thing which functions as a kind of parody and a commentary on intimate relations, on sexual relations, family relations, relations between men and women in the social world. Of course, a kid being a kid, once he's read out his rather literary story, he picks up a gun and starts firing. So we have this double thing in Godard's movies that children are both at the point where socialisation starts. That's to say, when society, the worst values of society are really getting into their heads and sort of making them what they're going to be as adults. They're internalising all these values, and at the same time, these kids have they're excessive creatures. They have excessive visions. They use language in crazy and poetic ways. and even more, they tend to completely, literally break out of the frame of the film that they're in. Of course, children, particularly if they're not trained actors, are almost completely undirectable, particularly the younger they are. And Godard uses that quality of excess, of, kids running wild, of you can't contain them in the frame of the movie. Here's a marvellous example at this moment here of Godard's work on sound, the exaggeration of the gunshot sound. Everything that we mentioned about the capitalist industrial society and the prison of measured time is really summed up in this dialogue between Juliet and her husband here. This notion, of course, that the story will never change, that it will always be the same, that social life is the cycle, and work, sleep, and get up again and work. It's interesting, in recent years, a philosopher who's had some influence on Godard, a guy named Jacques Rancière, has made a whole theory out of the notion that, basically, what do workers do at night? What do they dream of? What's their release? Do they get released from movies, from art, from music? What is it? How do we free up the prison of measured time, which is society? And I actually think that's been an intense question for Godard, at least since this period of the mid-60s, is given that we do all, in some sense, we're all cogs in the machine of industrial society. Just what are the spaces of resistance, of poetic experience, of insight? How can we break the cycles that imprison us day and night? This scene is a testament to Marina Vladi's cool as an actor, because you've got these kids going completely crazy here, but nonetheless she has to continue on with her reflective monologue. Once again, probably Godard's feeding her things to say. She's reacting to things. She's trying to hold this whole scene together. Of course, the character of Juliet is not only a housewife and a prostitute, she's also a mother. And the role of motherhood is something that Godard rarely dealt with. It's something he didn't necessarily have a lot of insight into. But in later years, actually I think it had a lot to do with actually having some children involved in his life more closely. And having that kind of relationship with his collaborator Anne-Marie Neuville that sort of allowed this proximity to domestic life, actually gave him, I think, more insight and certainly a more sort of tender way of seeing the family unit. The family unit in this case of two or three things is still a rather alienated affair. So at this point, we now have the husband going back to his sort of ham radio obsessions, one of the many signs of these sorts of individual sort of tunnel vision, solipsistic activities in the film. Him and his mate sort of, it's like this strange sort of male pastime. And of course, two or three things like a lot of Godard films, notes this sort of difference between the activities of women and the activities of men, masculine, feminine. Many of his films are sort of based on this sort of observation, sometimes in a rather sour way, that women are all about shopping and beautification and so on, fed by the consumer society, and that men are into technology and politics and facts and figures and science and logic and so on. And often that abyss between men and women is a very bleak thing in Godard's work. For instance, in the film I mentioned before, called Number 2, that he made in the mid-70s. Now we're reaching the finale of Two or Three Things I Know About Her. A kind of a very curt and to the point scene. And of course, it's very interesting that finally, we're going to end up in a scene in a bedroom. You know, it's going to be the domestic bedroom. Because the question of sexuality in a film, of course, is a completely alienated thing. It's, you know, it gets rooted through prostitution, through sexuality as it exists in newspaper advertisements, advertising, television, cinema, and so on. And when it comes down to, okay, a man and a woman, a husband and wife in bed together, of course, it's not a place of love or tenderness or eroticism or sensuality or sexuality at all. It is rather amusing that we seem to have some more of the strange equipment of the husbands at the side, audio equipment or whatever it is, and bed is this place for, you know, for reading books, of course, basically for conking out, for sleeping, so that the machinery of the capitalist world can sort of continue on. And it's a droll ending, a sort of a pessimistic ending to the film in Godard's view of it. Once again, you know, it's a constant thing in Godard that people's ideas about their own life, what am I feeling, what do I want in life, what are my dreams, what are my goals, completely funneled through magazines, you know, through glamour magazines, through polls, through quizzes, you know, pick a choice. What do you want from life, A, B, or C? This sort of whole consumer society mentality sort of forms consciousness at its most sort of limited point in the world of the film. This great image here with the cigarette, of course, returns us to the coffee cup and to the ambiguity of that image of the coffee cup in this one. That there's something, you know, marvelous and sort of poetic about that seeing that cigarette burn that way, but also something that's very kind of closed in. And that ambiguity goes right to the final reflection of Godard at the end of the movie. This dream, this very mid-60s dream, that one has to go back to zero. That if one tries to get rid of the past, one might be able to sort of form the new world, even form the new world from, in a sense, the garbage, the consumer garbage that he arrays on the grass. A very ambiguous image to mark an extremely transitional film in Jean-Luc Godard's career.
Je ne sais pas où, ni quand. Je me souviens seulement que c'est arrivé. C'est un sentiment que j'ai cherché toute la journée.